Kim Jong-un declares that North Korea will halt its nuclear testing program for what that's worth. We say goodbye to Barbara Bush, and we compare that great lady to Hillary Clinton and what it says about the state of our academic institutions. This is Vong, and this is A Civil Moment. Kim Jong-un declares that North Korea will unilaterally halt its nuclear weapons testing program. As I've said before, they have promised a lot of things over the years, and in fact, over the last multiple presidencies in the United States, a lot of things have been promised and then promptly walked back. It's not necessarily a bad thing that these promises are being made. It points to a potential for optimism. But with that optimism, the reality is, until there is actually something that can be proven, the words themselves are meaningless. And it's a promise for a negative act. That is to say, it is a promise not to do something. If there was a promise to do something that was verifiable, something that was concrete, it could independently be verified, and then we would know whether or not they had kept up their end of the bargain. But the bargain here, or at least the opening ante, is we're not going to do something. And while experts agree that North Korea's nuclear weapons program is not yet complete, that is to say that their capabilities to launch intercontinental ballistic missiles is not at the stage that we would expect that they could reliably deliver to targets outside of their immediate short-range area. That still puts South Korea and Japan well within reach of North Korea's nuclear weapons range. At any point up until North Korea does resume its testing, it can claim to have lived up to this particular promise. It is essentially posturing in advance of a meeting with Trump's administration at some point in the future. I don't believe this changes the status quo. North Korea is still a rogue state that is nuclear weapons capable, and this announcement should be taken with perhaps cautious optimism, with a heavy dose of caution. Last week, Barbara Bush passed away. She was the spouse of one U.S. president and the mother to a second. And before the cause of the social justice warrior was subverted by the left, Barbara Bush was a campaigner for much of her life for the causes of social justice. She spoke out against segregation and made it a core principle in her life to do what she could to eradicate illiteracy in America. She said, quote, "You don't just luck into things as much as you'd like to think you do. You build step by step, whether it's friendships or opportunities." This core principle of personal responsibility and the idea that we have control of our own destinies is central to libertarian and conservative philosophy. But she was never a slave to Republican orthodoxy. And in 1992, she stated that it was her belief that abortion was a private matter and something on which the Republican Party should not take a position. Now, whether or not you agree with any or all of her position, she carried herself with grace and dignity. As a believer that women are the equal of men, she gave a 1990 commencement speech to Wellesley College, where she said this:
"Somewhere out in this audience may even be someone who will one day follow in my footsteps and preside over the White House as the president's spouse, and I wish him well."
Only Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams and mother of John Quincy Adams, and Barbara Bush were both the spouse of one president and the parent of another. She had just celebrated her 73rd wedding anniversary with former President George Herbert Walker Bush and was 92 at the time of her passing. She is survived by her children, among them a former president and former governor, her 17 grandchildren and 7 great-grandchildren. It seems very unfair to Hillary Clinton that we segue from the life of Barbara Bush to statements that Mrs. Clinton has recently made. There's a reason we're bringing this all up, and some of these statements are not so recent, but it is instructive for us to look at why they're being said and what they represent, and the thinking behind the statements and the worldview being espoused by not just her supporters, but by the left in general. A book is coming out this week, and its author was given access to the Clinton campaign during the 2016 presidential elections. And a statement that Mrs. Clinton made upon learning that she had lost the election was, I quote, "They were never going to let me be president." It is absolutely incredible that she would have the nerve to say this. This is a statement that Bernie Sanders could have said about Hillary Clinton and the Democratic National Convention. They were never going to let me be the nominee. After all, she had people who were not only affiliated with the Democratic National Convention, working at CNN, namely Donna Brazile, feeding her questions before a town hall debate that was going to happen, putting the other nominees at incredible disadvantage. And if there's any question about whether or not the odds were stacked against Bernie Sanders, Donna Brazile wrote in her book, quote, "I had promised Bernie when I took the helm of the Democratic National Committee after the convention that I would get to the bottom of whether Hillary's team had rigged the nomination process." And then after she said that she had discovered a document proving it, she said, quote, "I had found my proof, and it broke my heart." While Donna Brazile's poor broken heart aside, that's not the only proof. It was evident to anybody watching that there was never going to be a nominee other than Hillary Clinton. The idea that was rampant throughout not just Democratic circles, but in the media was that it was, quote, her turn. So for her to come out and say they, and who is they exactly, but that they were never going to allow Hillary to become president is laughable. But the reason that this is so instructive is it stands in such sharp contrast to the idea that Barbara Bush believed that even in the instances where you could say that luck played some role, that a person's actions bring them luck, put them in a position where opportunity comes knocking, puts them in a position where the alliances that they've made, the friends and acquaintances that they've nurtured will come through. It is decidedly different than the worldview where they are the reason for any failures on a person's part. Hillary's philosophy is not just unique to her, nor is it new to Hillary just at the beginning or during the 2016 presidential elections. It has followed her throughout her career. In 1998, during the height of the Monica Lewinsky scandal for President Bill Clinton, she claimed that a, quote, vast right-wing conspiracy was out to get them.
The great story here, for anybody willing to find it and write about it and explain it, is this vast right-wing conspiracy that has been conspiring against my husband since the day he announced for president.
Recall then that Hillary and her allies in the media worked tirelessly at that point to destroy the credibility of Monica Lewinsky in defense of President Bill Clinton and his presidency, and contrast that with the media's treatment of Stormy Daniels and their attempt to portray her as some kind of heroine. And keep in mind, the circumstances are eerily similar. Both are adulterous relationships, but between consenting adults. But Hillary never backed away from the claim of a right-wing conspiracy. She invoked it again during her 2016 campaign. There's always some they out to get Hillary Clinton. There's always some reason for Hillary's failures outside of Hillary herself. And we need not look any farther than to see what Hillary Clinton is blaming for the loss of her election. Here are a few examples.
When you run to succeed a two-term president of your own party, you have a historical headwind blowing against you.
So, item number 1, Obama is the reason Hillary lost the election.
I was on the way to winning until the combination of Jim Comey's letter on October 28th and Russian WikiLeaks raised doubts in the minds of people who were inclined to vote for me but got scared off.
Comey and the Russians scaring people off of voting for Hillary.
The use of my email account was turned into, the biggest scandal since Lord knows when.
Hillary breaking the law and getting a pass for it as an excuse for why she didn't get elected to the office of the presidency.
I inherit nothing from the Democratic Party.
Other than having the nomination process rigged in her favor, the DNC as a reason that she was not able to win the presidency.
You could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. Right? The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it.
63 million people voted for Trump, so 31.5 million deplorables, Islamophobic, homophobic, you name it, as the reason that Hillary didn't win the presidency.
If you look at Facebook, the vast majority of the news items posted were fake.
Fake news as the reason that Hillary lost the election.
We do not do well with white men, and we don't do well with married white women. And part of that is an identification with the Republican Party and a sort of ongoing pressure to vote the way that your husband, your boss, your son, whoever, believes you should.
Women who can't think for themselves as another reason that Hillary lost the election.
White women who were going to vote for me and frankly standing up to the men in their lives and the men in their workplaces were being told, she's going to jail. You don't want to vote for her. It's going to be terrible. You can't vote for that.
Women who lost their nerve after having stood up to the men in their lives and who feared that Hillary might go to jail for the things that put other people in jail were the reason that she lost the election.
There's all these stories about, guys over in Macedonia who are running these fake news sites.
Okay, what? Macedonians running fake news sites as a reason that Hillary lost the election. We don't have time to go on with more of these examples, but to be fair to Hillary, she has also, to some degree, admitted that they did things wrong, that it was not just these outside factors that caused her to lose the election. Did Comey have an influence on the outcome of the election? Absolutely. Can we quantify what that is? It's hard to say. But what we do know is Comey is now busy reaping millions from the same people who are just thrilled that he's targeting Trump instead. Are there women who feel that way about Hillary? Are there women who are browbeat into voting the ways that their husbands or sons or brothers or other male figures in their life are forcing them to? I think it's myopic to believe that such a scenario doesn't exist. But it's equally myopic and cynical to believe that it is such a large portion of our voting electorate that it could swing the election in any appreciable manner. And it's instructive that Clinton actually believes, as a feminist or as a feminist icon, that these women need to be rescued from the clutches and the machinations and the influences of these males in their lives that would dictate how they think. It's a bizarre worldview to believe that the women who are voting for you are doing what is in their heart that they believe to be true. And the women who are not voting for you are not doing it on the basis of what you represent and your positions and the, quite frankly, sordid history of your political career, but that they are being forced to vote against their identity because of strong-willed males in their lives. We begin to see an inkling into one of the new cores of leftist policy, leftist ideology. And here we make a distinction between what is the left and what is liberal thought. I wholly disapprove of what you say, but will defend to death your right to say it. That is a quote that is paramount in liberal thought. The idea of freedom of speech is absolutely central to liberal thinking, even more so than it is to conservative thinking, and probably on par with what a libertarian would believe. The left does not believe this, and it is not liberal thinking or conservative thinking or libertarian thinking that poses a threat to our freedoms right now. Right now, the radical left that has infiltrated our academic institutions pose the greatest threat to Western culture. In a Brookings Institute poll released in 2015, the question was raised, does the First Amendment protect hate speech? 39%, only 39% of respondents who were college students said yes. 16% said they didn't know. 44%, or a plurality, said no. The First Amendment does not protect hate speech. But again, who defines hate speech? And just so we're clear, this is what the Supreme Court had to say on the matter as recently as 2017. Justice Samuel Alito wrote, "The idea that government may restrict speech expressing ideas that offend strikes at the heart of the First Amendment. Speech that demeans on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, age, disability, or any other similar grounds is hateful. But the proudest boast of our free speech jurisprudence is that we protect the freedom to express the thought that we hate." Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote this, "A law found to discriminate based on viewpoint is an egregious form of content discrimination, which is presumptively unconstitutional. A law that can be directed against speech found offensive to some portion of the public can be turned against minority and dissenting views to the detriment of all. The First Amendment does not entrust the power to the government's benevolence. Instead, our reliance must be on the substantial safeguards of free and open discussion in a democratic society." The justices were unanimous in their decision that free speech does not have a hate speech exception. All speech is protected. They cite the same reasons I articulate here. Absent a definition of hate speech, and we cannot trust in biased and flawed humans to determine what that is, because it will not be the same for all people, because it is highly subjective. Absent that, we must protect all speech in order that we have free speech. But so first, you have the plurality of people, 44% at universities, believing that hate speech is not protected. What do they intend to do about it? In the same study, when asked if the university should invite a controversial speaker to an on-campus event, and that speaker is known for making offensive and hurtful statements, a student group opposed to the speaker disrupts the speech by loudly and repeatedly shouting so that the audience cannot hear the speaker. Do you agree or disagree with the student group's actions are acceptable? 51% believe that it is acceptable in an institution of higher learning where ideas are supposed to be met with other ideas. 51% agree that it is okay to shout over people with whom they disagree. Let's not confuse this with the idea that free speech is protected by the Constitution. Let us dispense with the supposition that jailing someone for what they say is the same as shouting over them. But still, if the use and purpose of university and education is to expose people to ideas that are challenging, to force them to come up with their own ideas, that in the conflict and the crucible of thought and conversation, that a true idea or a better idea should emerge. And you stifle that. If 51% of the people believe that it is okay to take away someone's ability to espouse those ideas, no matter how personally hateful they may be, because they can always choose not to be there. They can choose not to listen. They can choose to present their own ideas, their superior ideas. And let's not pretend that everybody who speaks at a university or a place of higher education is wholesome or that their ideas are good. But the idea itself that it is okay to prevent others from listening to the idea, that gives credence to the fact that their ideas might resonate with somebody. And if you cannot fight an idea with a better idea, then perhaps your ideas require refining. And that's the whole point of the educational system, is to refine ideas, to chip away at the flaws in rational thinking, to come up with a better idea. And we give that up when we refuse to listen. For that particular question, the breakdown is 62% of Democrats polled believe that it is acceptable to shout down someone whose ideas you find offensive. 39% of Republicans feel the same way. If you were to break it down by sex, 47% of females feel that that is acceptable practice compared to a higher 57% of males. The study continues, and the question is posed that a public university invites a very controversial speaker to an on-campus event. The speaker is known for making offensive and hurtful statements. A student group opposed to the speaker uses violence to prevent the speaker from speaking. Do you agree or disagree that the student group's actions are acceptable? 19%, 1 in 5, believe that it is acceptable to use violence to combat so-called hate speech. And in this instance, Democrats are 20%. 20% of Democrats feel that that's acceptable. 22% of Republicans feel that that is acceptable. And of females, 10%, and males, 30%, feel that that is acceptable. This is absolutely mind-boggling. Now you're starting to speak to the core of the disconnect. You are starting to speak to the core of where shouting down somebody as an exercise in free speech to counter speech, while repugnant, pales in comparison to doing violence to them. And you must believe then that if you are willing to do violence to somebody because of what they're saying, you certainly feel that jailing them would be an appropriate behavior. This is exactly the opposite of the idea of free speech. And we've already seen some of these incidences where speakers are, at the very least, being heckled by crowds and preventing them from speaking. This happens regularly to a lot of conservative personalities. And violence has also been a cause for concern. When Charles Murray was asked to speak at Middlebury College, a liberal professor, Allison Stanger, who was there as a counterpoint to Murray, attempted to escort him from the premises after a loud and raucous and violent protest. The protesters, some of whom were wearing masks, began to push them. And when Professor Stanger attempted to shield Murray, a protester grabbed her hair and twisted her neck. She ended up in the hospital with a neck brace. And what she was doing there with Charles Murray was to ask him hard questions, was to engage in the things that he believes in his studies and get to the bottom of his work. But because his work deals in controversial topics like intelligence and the heritability of intelligence, and by extension, the idea of racial distributions of intelligence, he was not only denied the right to speak, but he was attacked. and lumping in and conflating Charles Murray with people like Richard Spencer, who are out and out white supremacists, unabashedly white supremacists, unabashedly racist, is detrimental to everything that a university should be about. And even though Richard Spencer is a white supremacist, he too should be afforded the right to speak. And we should all be afforded the right, and we have the right, to reject his message, to come up with a better idea, to say that I wholly disapprove of what you say, but will defend to death your right to say it. And that doesn't go just for Richard Spencer. That goes for people like Louis Farrakhan, who is an open anti-Semite and racist. There is no such thing as a slippery slope when it comes to free speech. Free speech is the founding principle. There's a reason it's the First Amendment. It is the summit on which we build our civilization. The belief that every person can speak freely, and then as a consequence of that, think freely and act freely. There is no slippery slope. There is only the summit and a long fall to the rocks below. On the right, you have the ideology of fascism. And in Nazi Germany, Joseph Goebbels was the minister of propaganda, and censorship was extreme and strictly enforced by the Nazi Party. On the left, you have the USSR, where Alexander Solzhenitsyn was not allowed to publish his book, The Gulag Archipelago. And it wasn't until 1973, 5 years after he had written it, was it published in the West as a damning indictment on the idea of leftist authoritarianism and communism. And we see it today in North Korea. We see it today in China. Nobody starts out by believing that they are attacking free speech. They start out by saying we are protecting these people. We are protecting these minorities. We are protecting these ideas. We are protecting our comrades. We are protecting the people. We are protecting the state. I suppose it's easier on the right to see where right-wing ideology goes too far. Once you get to ethno-superiority or ethno-nationalism, you begin to see the shape of fascism take form. On the left, it's less delineated, but there is no doubt that radical leftism has been the cause of death and misery and suffering for hundreds of millions throughout the whole of human history. And every single one of these authoritarian regimes seeks to limit the freedom of expression. The freedom of expression and the freedom of speech is necessary for the freedom of thought and the freedom of action. And those freedoms prevent these types of people from coming into power. It's like a canary in a coal mine. You know you're in danger when the canary dies. You know there is some invisible danger present. And for a democracy, for a free people, that is when your liberties are taken away. That is the canary. When your right to free speech and your right to free expression die, something insidious and hidden is waiting to take shape. Now, to say that shouting down someone who purveys hate on a college campus leads directly to tyranny might seem a stretch, and that's not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is that the freedom of ideas and expression and thought and speech are so vital, especially when we are so polarized, especially when we are so easy to come to blows over our ideas and ideologies, especially when it is so tempting to silence those with whom we disagree. That is when we must listen the hardest. Because what happens when you take an idea and we find it so reprehensible that we don't allow it to be spoken is that it gets spoken anyway. And because a bad idea does not get to see the light of day and be brought down by a better idea, it gives that idea power when it is brought up in hushed tones as forbidden knowledge. There is no one there, and there is no idea that has been put forth to combat it. And you will have people who are looking for meaning attach themselves to that idea because it hasn't been challenged in the public sphere, because it hasn't been put through the crucible and determined to be inferior. I've often lamented that social media promotes echo chambers. There is good and evil to the media. But young people who go to university for the first time are perhaps, for the first time in their lives, really exposed to ideas outside of their close circle of friends and acquaintances. They are treating it in a way that they would in social media. You ignore or dislike or drown out that which you don't wish to hear and see. And you often see that there is the ability in social media to block people, to ignore their posts, to otherwise insulate yourself from what it is that they have to say. This crosses over into our university system, and it's unfortunate because, again, the belief that we have to find and face challenging ideas in order to grow is well-founded. Nobody who has a meaningful conversation, either privately or in the public sphere, is immune to criticism. But the hope is, whether or not you disagree with them, whether or not you disagree with what I have to say, that we can all agree, no matter how wholly we disagree with what we might say to one another, we will defend to death the right of the other to say it. On a lighter note, on Friday in Australia, a 3-year-old girl named Aurora wandered off on her own, but a search of the woodland and hills on the rural property where she lived found no trace of her. On Saturday morning, more than 100 state emergency services volunteers, police, and members of the public continued to look for her and found the girl safe with Max, the dog, at 8 o'clock in the morning. The dog is 17 years old, deaf and partially blind, and stayed with her all night to keep her warm. In the morning, he went looking for help and came upon the rescuers, who he then led back to Aurora, who was scratched and had some minor cuts but was otherwise unharmed thanks to her four-legged friend. For his heroics, Max has been made an honorary police dog. Good boy, Max. If you've enjoyed this program or found it informative or enlightening, please subscribe. The Civil Moment podcast is new, and your support and involvement is greatly appreciated and absolutely vital if we are to continue doing this. Listen to our podcast on iTunes or SoundCloud and leave a review. Our audio is now also available on YouTube. Follow us on social media at Facebook or Twitter. Like and share our podcast announcement. It all helps. You can contact us by sending an email to podcast@civilmoment.com or visiting us on our website at www.civilmoment.com. Thank you. Until next time, I'm Vong, and this has been A Civil Moment. This podcast, copyright 2018, Phase Final Incorporated.